Joining us today on our live webcast. This event to launch the IPBES Nexus assessment will begin in about 5 minutes. So to everybody who is joining us on the webcast on YouTube, we look forward to joining you again very shortly.
In the same way that out-of-tune musical instruments sound even worse when played together, environmental, social, and economic challenges are worse when they all hit at the same time. Tuned separately, an instrument might sound fine, but without collective tuning, it can clash when played with others. Like tuning an instrument, actions to address interlinked environmental threats that are taken in isolation make them less effective, more discordant, and often have unintended consequences. Crises in biodiversity, water and food, human health, and the dangerously changing climate are intertwined in ways that cascade and compound each other, and therefore are best addressed together. On 17 December 2024, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, plans to release the results of the Nexus assessment, among the most ambitious scientific assessments ever undertaken. The report explores the complex but critical interlinkages, or nexus, of biodiversity, water, food, and health in the context of climate change. 165 of the world's leading scientists and experts have worked for 3 years to uncover complementarities, trade-offs, and the need for different sectors to tune their actions together. The report will offer a symphony of solutions to break out of the silos of single-issue approaches, helping to harmonize responses and provide options for better outcomes across collective crises. IPBES, Science and Policy for People and Nature.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to say a very big thank you to everybody for joining us today, both in person here in Windhoek, Namibia, where we have just concluded the first ever African plenary session, or the first ever IPBES plenary session on African soil. And to everybody joining us online for all around the world, whether you're joining us as a member of the media through the Zoom webinar, or if you're joining us on our YouTube link, you are most welcome. We're very pleased that you're going to spend some time with us today finding out more about the IPBES Nexus assessment. My name is Rob Spall. I'm the head of communications at the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, and welcome to this media launch of the IPBES Nexus Assessment Report. To begin, I'd like to make an announcement, and that is the media embargo is now officially lifted. That means anybody who has prepared articles or posts or anything to do with the report is now free and totally at liberty to go ahead and publish those. Before we continue, I would like to ask those journalists joining us online through the webinar to please submit questions to our panel through the Zoom webinar's question and answer function. Please do not use the chat function. This is slightly different from most normal Zoom calls. The chat is primarily for alerting us if there are any technical issues with the sound quality or those sorts of things. But if you would like to be posing a question to our panel later in this program, please use the Q&A question and answer function. Please also remember to start your question by giving us your full name and the media outlet that you represent. And just to make the point, this is a media launch, so we will be prioritizing questions from media, although partners are more than welcome to pose questions as well, which we'll try and get to should there be time. A reminder as well that you can follow along with the launch on social media using the hashtag Nexus Assessment. So that's hashtag Nexus Assessment, all one word. And please do tag @IPBES in your posts so that we can also help amplify those. To begin, I would like to introduce our speakers today, starting with the Executive Secretary of IPBES, Dr. Anne Laragadri. I would also like to welcome the Chair of IPBES, Dr. David Abura, and a very special word of welcome to the two co-chairs of the IPBES Nexus Assessment. They are Professor Pamela McElvey and Professor Paula Harrison. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge all of the IPBES experts who have been authors on this very complex, very ambitious assessment. We're very pleased to be joined by many of the coordinating lead authors with us here today, and I'm going to ask each of them just to raise a hand as I mention their names so that any of the journalists here who might like to identify them in person are able to do so. So starting with Fabrice de Klerk, Ralph Seppelt, Paula Prist, Susanna Hamachkova, Mark Runsefeld, unfortunately, is with us. My apologies, Mark. I was about to say you weren't able to join us, but he has been able to join us. Odirilwe Selomane, Diana Mangalaju, Nadia Sitas, Virginia Alonso Roldan, and Ro McFarlane. And although we're super pleased to have this selection of authors with us, this is just a small subset of the people who have worked for the last 3 years on this really important landmark IPBES report. And to any of the other authors who are listening and joining us remotely, a big thank you, and we wish that you were with us in person as well to be part of this launch. We know that you're joining us in spirit for this. So I'd also like to take a moment to introduce a few members of the IPBES communications team who will be helping out today. Terry Collins, Carla Brown, and Aditi Sahay are helping us with the webcast questions, and Aditi will also be your point of contact if you would like to request interviews with any of our authors, should you be a journalist here with us in person. I'd now like to take a moment to invite the Executive Secretary of IPBES, Dr. Anne Laragadri, to make some introductory comments. So Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and greetings to all from Windhoek here in Namibia, where the IPBES 11 plenary session ended last night after 7 days of negotiations among the IPBES members, and IPBES counts 147 governments as members. So there were three main objectives to this IPBES 11 plenary. First, to approve the Nexus assessment, that's the focus of today. Secondly, to approve the transformative change assessment. And third, to approve a roadmap, and we call it the scoping report, for a second global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services planned for delivery in 2028. In addition to this, IPBES 11 also decided to host its next session, the 12th session, in the UK, and the focus will be on a much awaited report which deals with biodiversity and business. But coming now to the Nexus assessment, it's a report which looks at the options to simultaneously try to reach our development goals that are related to food, water, health, climate/energy, thanks to a more sustainable use of biodiversity rather than at the expense of biodiversity and in degrading nature. And this report really responds to the most critical questions that the world needs to urgently address. It's a report which took close to 40 hours, I believe, of negotiations among member states. It was prepared by 165 scientists from all regions of the world, from all disciplines, and together they analyzed more than 6,000 scientific references, as well as indigenous and local knowledge. So why a report on this topic? Well, that is because there are really complex interlinkages between these 5 elements: food, water, health, biodiversity, climate change. They are not well understood, but moreover, because of this ignorance about the interlinkages, they are addressed separately from each other, and doing so leads to a problem. So one example is, for example, planting trees at large scale to mitigate climate change, which can have a negative impact on biodiversity as well, also as food security. Now, in terms of its significance, it's a report that was requested by many governments. It was also requested by the 190 plus members from the Convention on Biological Diversity through a decision of its COPs and many other non-governmental organizations, and it is expected that it will inform, among others, the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, but also policy at national and international level of specialized agencies such as the FAO for food policy or the WHO for health policy, for example. And then finally, to conclude, at IPBES, we are very, very pleased to have reached all of our objectives on topics which are complex, which may be controversial for a multilateral conversation. And we are pleased because it's been, as you will have noted, a very complicated multilateral context lately, which has seen many recent conferences of the parties unable to complete their work, such as the Rio Convention or the Plastic Treaty, to name just a few. So with this, that concludes my opening remarks, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anne. As Anne has mentioned, the fact that we're able to end the year on a high note for multilateralism with an agreement of two such complex and such important reports is a fantastic thing for the IPBES community and for policymakers and decision makers around the world. Before I hand the floor to our co-chairs of the assessment to talk a bit about the findings of this report, I would like to invite those journalists who are joining us on the Zoom webinar to be thinking about questions that you would like to be submitting in the question and answer session as these questions come to mind, either from the presentations that Anne or David Obura, our chair, will be making, or obviously about the presentation itself from the two co-chairs. Please submit those questions to us using the question and answer function on the Zoom webinar. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce to you the two co-chairs of the Nexus assessment. And I have already mentioned their names before, but they bear mentioning again, Professor Paula Harrison and Professor Pamela McElvey, who are going to share with us and share with the world the findings of the work of these hundreds of experts, thousands of sources, and 3 years of investment of time, expertise, and passion. So I'd like to hand over first to Professor Paula Harrison. Paula, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob. So Pam and I are now going to just present
We seem to have a small technical difficulty with advancing the slides. Please bear with us for a moment. To advance the slides manually, would you be able to ask us to say next slide? I think that might work.
Of course.
I see we have some movement. The clicker is working again. So, with that small diversion from our planned programming, I return you now to Professor Paula Harrison.
Thank you, Rob. So yes, so Pam and I are going to take you through a quick overview of the Nexus assessment report. I will quickly introduce the process and the amazing team behind the report, and then we're going to focus on the assessment findings, introduce you to the key findings, some of the options that we are suggesting for Nexus action, and how they are relevant for addressing our interconnected global crises and challenges. So first starting with an introduction to the process. It was produced, as mentioned by both Anne and Rob, over a period of 3 years. We've had a series of author meetings in that period, both to advance the chapters and the summary for policymakers that has been released today. An important part in that process is the external review, which allows both experts and governments to provide comments to improve the content of the report. So we had 2 external reviews for both experts and governments, and an additional government review of the summary for policymakers over the 3-year period. The knowledge and evidence within the report draws on around 6,500 sources of evidence, which is taken from the peer-reviewed literature, the grey literature, and including indigenous and local knowledge. And this includes references and data sources from all of the IPBES regions. The assessment considers the IPBES conceptual framework, which looks at the interlinkages between indirect and direct drivers of biodiversity loss, how they affect nature and nature's contributions to people, and our quality of life, and how the different components of the nexus for us, biodiversity, water, food, health and climate change map onto the IPBES conceptual framework. The assessment also recognises and considers different worldviews, values and knowledge systems. The assessment team is very large. It consists of 165 selected experts. You've already been introduced to Pam and myself as co-chairs. And we have many other experts that have formed an amazing team over this 3-year period, covering a range of disciplines from the biophysical and social sciences, and also covering all of those different nexus elements from food and water and biodiversity, climate change specialists and health sector specialists. We've been supported during this period by a technical support unit and a management committee that consists of members of the IPBES Bureau and the IPBES Multidisciplinary Expert Panel. So now moving on to introducing you to the findings of the assessment. And here we're going to be talking through the different sections of our summary for policymakers. And in section A of the summary, here this is where we set out the really important problem that we're facing here of these interlinkages between our 5 nexus elements. Again, biodiversity, water, food, health and climate change, understanding those interlinkages and exploring who is most affected by the different interlinkages, whether they be positive or negative. Section B builds upon this and it explores possible future nexus interactions using scenario studies that take assumptions around policies and actions that might occur in the future to actually understand the longer term challenges and opportunities for action within and across these 5 nexus elements. Section C really moves to the solutions, and here we present the numerous available and feasible response options that allow holistic policy in action and that is able to benefit our multiple nexus elements. And then section D builds upon this, with section C presenting what those response options are, and section D focusing on the process and the how of their implementation, looking at governance and financing that would improve the way we can manage the interlinkages between these different nexus elements so that we can move towards more just and sustainable futures. And as part of this section, we offer a roadmap for nexus action. So just to take you through those sections and some of the key findings from them. Section A, again, as I said, this is setting out the problem that this nexus assessment is addressing. And here we're looking at past and current trends in nexus elements and their interactions. The first key finding here really emphasizes the really important role that biodiversity plays in underpinning the nexus elements in terms of its essential role in providing our water and our food supplies, in contributing to our health and our well-being, and in the stability of our climate system. But yet we know from data and statistics that biodiversity is declining in all regions of the world. The section then looks at why this might be happening. What are the underlying causes of these, the degradation in these different elements, and particularly in biodiversity? It looks at what's happening to the trends in different indirect drivers, such as economic, demographic, technical, cultural, and institutional drivers, and has a look at which of these are increasing, and those that are increasing that are then amplifying the effects of direct drivers of biodiversity loss, such as land and sea use change, unsustainable exploitation and pollution, that then have cascading impacts across our different nexus elements. We provide different examples of these interactions and how they relate to those indirect and direct drivers and how they lead to these cascading impacts. And the figure showed in this slide, which is taken from figure SPM4 panel B, is an example of some of those cascading impacts based on an illustration of when the direct driver of land use change through land conversion from a biodiverse ecosystem into intensive, unsustainable agricultural production can lead to negative impacts in terms of increased pesticide and fertilizer use, reductions in water quality, increases in water use, contributions to climate change through higher greenhouse gas emissions, which have cascading effects on human health and on reducing biodiversity. This section also looks at how our current societal, economic and policy decisions prioritise just a few of these nexus elements, and particularly looking at water and food supply, and also whilst ignoring the value of the other elements that underpin those nature's contributions to people. It looks as well at the short-term benefits, rather whilst ignoring the negative impacts on the nexus element that emerge from those decisions. Section B looks at future nexus interactions, and this is based on analysis of 186 scenario studies that we classify into different clusters of different types of scenarios based on their outcomes for the 5 nexus elements. And this is illustrated by the table shown in this slide, which is taken from figure SPM 5, panel A, where the nexus scenario archetypes at the top rows of this table show those scenarios that are more beneficial and more balanced across the nexus elements, providing benefits across all 5 elements. Whereas when we move towards the bottom of the table, we can see there are trade-offs, with some nexus elements improving whilst others decline. And at the very bottom of the table, we're in a scenario archetype that leads to negative impacts across all of the nexus elements. The food first and the nexus over exploitation, some types of scenarios, represent business as usual types of approaches that continue current trends in direct and indirect drivers. And the analysis of these scenarios show that these types of scenarios will result in substantial negative outcomes for biodiversity, water, food and health, while also exacerbating climate change. Looking at some of the other scenarios as well that prioritize single nexus elements such as food, without taking account of the consequences on other nexus elements, we can see trade-offs emerge. And you can see this in the table for scenario archetype 5, food first, where you can see benefits for food and for nutritional health, but negative effects on biodiversity, water and climate. This work also shows that it is possible to have positive outcomes for people and nature, but it's really important to get these that we have integrated and timely adoption of multiple response options. And these include combining options that look at sustainable consumption and production with conservation and restoration of ecosystems, reduction in pollution, and large-scale adaptation and mitigation to climate change. In section B, we also compare these scenarios to how they may advance achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And here we can see that those scenarios that balance outcomes across our 5 nexus elements are more likely to have beneficial outcomes across the Sustainable Development Goals than those that either prioritize single nexus elements and lead to trade-offs, or those that really ignore environmental concerns and continue with current the degradation of nature. And again, the slide here is from figure SPM 6 of the summary for policymakers. And again, you can see towards the left-hand side of the figure where we have the nexus scenario archetypes 1 and 2, you see more blue, positive impacts across the nexus elements. And as we move towards the right, as we move towards more business as usual scenarios, we see more and more red negative effects. So now I'll just hand over to Pam to look at section C.
Great, thanks Paula. So section C is really about our solutions. What are the response options that might help us address these nexus interactions and achieve multiple benefits across our elements of biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate? So one of the key findings of the assessment is that there are many response options that are available now. We don't have to wait for them. And they're available to different types of actors across multiple sectors. And what they will enable us to do is to sustainably manage those nexus elements in appropriate ways. One of the things that's really key is that response options benefit multiple nexus elements when we treat them in a way that acknowledges their interactions. So in some cases, there may be some trade-offs, but if we approach the response option with knowledge of those trade-offs from the beginning, we can manage for them. It's also very important to note that these response options are context dependent. Not every response option is going to apply in every situation or at every scale. And so that's a really important reason why we present over 70 different response options, knowing that different places and different actors will be able to use this as a menu of options and choose which ones are appropriate for their particular context. So we have some examples here of response options that get us benefits across the 5 Nexus elements. These include conserving or halting conversion of ecosystems that have high ecological integrity. It includes conserving and restoring mangroves, particularly oriented towards health benefits, increasing soil organic carbon to help achieve higher productivity of food while also mitigating climate change. Integrating landscape and seascape approaches, noting that how we manage on land often has compounding impacts further downstream in coastal and marine systems, and a response option such as community water management, which really focuses on the very local scale and encourages decision-making and participation that is really suited to local contexts. So we have a figure SPM 8. I realize it's quite busy and hard to read at this scale, but what this figure tells us is that of the more than 70 response options we've assessed, many of them have those multiple co-benefits, and you can see the mini blue dots. Those are all positive benefits for our Nexus elements. In a few cases, there are trade-offs. There are some red dots on there as well. And the assessment makes the important point is that we can't always avoid trade-offs, but what we can do is acknowledge and manage for them. Right now, we try to ignore many of them, and that results in unaccounted for costs and unintended consequences. A final key note on figure SPM 8, many of the high positive benefits for biodiversity specifically are coming from response options that are mainly managed or devised or designed by other sectors. So folks in the water sector or in the food sector often have higher benefits in terms of those response options on biodiversity than some of our more traditional biodiversity measures. So that really argues for acknowledging the interdependencies among these sectors. One of the other key findings is that these response options also help us meet our global policy frameworks and goals. Particularly when we implement response options together or in sequence, we call them bundling and sequencing, that tends to enhance their Nexus-wide benefits. So for example, if we address sustainable healthy diets together with also tackling food lost and waste, that'll enable us to tackle halting conversion of land for agriculture. So sequencing these options is very important, or putting options together, because many of these options may enable one another if they're implemented in a bundle. They can also help us achieve our important policy goals. This is figure SPM 10, panel C, and it shows of our 10 broad categories of response options, all of them have benefits for SDGs, for the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework targets, as well as the mitigation and adaptation goals of the Paris Agreement. So these response options are really key for helping us achieve these policy goals, and in fact, they can enhance the synergies between these global frameworks. We talk a lot about the need for these frameworks to speak to one another, and our response options can be a key implementing tool for that to happen. Finally, in section D, we talk about the broad needs for governing the Nexus to achieve just and sustainable futures. Our assessment looked at all types of governance approaches and discusses the ways in which Nexus governance, trying to govern across our Nexus elements, can really be enhanced when we pay attention to key components, such as integrative approaches, inclusive, equitable, accountable, coordinated, and adaptive approaches, because that is what is going to help us have more successful implementation of those 70+ response options that I just spoke about. So these governance approaches can also be facilitated by acknowledging we need transformation of economic and financial systems as well. If we're able to do that, our economic systems will deliver greater investment across the Nexus elements. It'll help enhance the stability of our financial system while also increasing equity within it, and it will help deliver on our sustainable development outcomes. We also assessed the process to get us there, because we know that there's a lot of good solutions out there and that we can learn from how they have been able to bring stakeholders together, to work together in a wide range of sectors and actors, to work collaboratively and participatorily to achieve sustainable futures. And so we designed figure SPM 13, which is called a roadmap for Nexus action, which takes us through a series of steps which have been shown in other circumstances to be really key for understanding the context in which Nexus interactions occur, bringing people together around coordination and strategic action, and finally implementation, scaling, and monitoring so that we know what works and that we're able to adaptively realign where we need to. Finally, I want to just stress the importance and the relevancy of the Nexus assessment. We heard already that we hope that it will be taken up by some of our Rio conventions. The Convention on Biological Diversity in particular is in a process where some of the National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans are still being revised, and we hope that this will provide a really important context for decision makers and policymakers and a large variety of stakeholders to be able to use our best available evidence on these interlinkages and draw those into their action plans, strategies, and so forth. We also have a lot of guidance for economic, financial, and governance systems about how to achieve more holistic and integrated outcomes. We also pay a lot of attention to the importance of many different actors. So these are not just governments that can take action. They can be at local levels, they can be communities, they can be civic organizations. There are tools for everyone within our report. And finally, as I stressed, we're in a really important time period. We're almost halfway to 2030 and the achievement, we hope, of our Sustainable Development Goals. And so we hope that our assessment will provide a toolkit, a roadmap for those more integrated decisions and actions to support all of our multilateral agreements and processes. So with that, I think our presentation has concluded, and I will turn over to Rob.
So a very big thank you to Paula and to Pam and to every single person, both in this room and not in this room, who contributed to making the Nexus assessment possible. When we first started this process and I was asked to try and explain to journalists what the Nexus was, or to try and explain why the Nexus was important or why people should care about it, we had very little inkling quite how complex and ambitious a report this was actually going to be. And one of the great things about this author team is the ability that they have to make it real for people, to really give concrete examples of what the Nexus looks like, what Nexus governance approaches look like, and what Nexus problems need to be addressed. So I'm sure we'll get to that in the question and answer session. But right now, just a quick reminder again, we have in the region of about 180 people online at the moment who are following this launch, which is a fantastic number. To all of you who are following us online, I would like to again, if you're on the Zoom webinar particularly, invite you as journalists to please submit questions for our panelists through the question and answer function. And with that, I would like to invite the chair of IPBES, Dr. David Obura, who has had a particularly busy week, to take the floor and to deliver some comments. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rob, and good day to everybody online and everybody in the room. It's a real pleasure to be here. So this assessment coming out and launching it right at this moment is a great point of pride for me. Not only is it best chair, because of course this is a product of our platform, but being in Namibia in Africa, and I'm the first African chair of IPBES, it's also great to host the plenary here. Also, I was very closely associated with this assessment for a couple of years, so it's wonderful to see how wonderful it is and how this team has produced such an excellent report that contributes so many solutions to all people around the world. I'd like to thank our Namibian hosts. We've had a wonderful plenary over here. We've been hosted in great style and in a great facility and with music and culture as well that has really, I think, transformed the plenary at times in our discussions. And so I want to thank them also very much. Now, this assessment on the interlinkages between biodiversity, food, water, health, and climate change, I think is critically important at the moment because it deals with so many of the tangible challenges that we face around the world. I think one of the really important things about how it best works, if I can mention that, is that the connections between the things that we do are critically important in science being understood in the real world and by governments. IPBES itself brings multiple stakeholder groups together. We have our knowledge community, the scientists, and our task forces and assessment author groups, as you've heard from now and you'll be questioning in a moment, are of course the core of what we do. We also have a secretariat that runs everything, and without the secretariat managing such complex multi-stakeholder processes, it would never work and would never get to such great media launches as this. So I want to acknowledge all the work that they do. And then there's the delegations, the countries who come to these plenaries. And they request these reports over a period of time. There's a dialogue back and forth with the scientists. And then the final dialogue is, as has happened over here, when a report is being produced. And the countries really query the relevance of the content of the reports, and the scientists explain that, and we come up with a summary for policymakers. And it's in that dialogue that I hope that the rubber really hits the road, because from now, as we launch this report, we try and get to impact with the language and the messaging that is in the assessment text, in the whole assessment itself. How can we get this knowledge back to stakeholders, back into the countries that face the challenges on the ground and that requested this content? This content is so relevant to all stakeholders around the world. We're facing these interconnected crises across many different sectors in many different ways. It's very relevant in Africa, where much of our population is highly dependent on nature and its services and contributions for their livelihoods. So we pepper the assessment with case studies to make it very tangible at grassroots level. And of course, we can't address all of the localization and the nuance that happens around the world, but of course, people can learn from case studies and relate that to their particular context. We try and spread the word in national platforms and processes, and with this plenary being in Africa, there's great excitement amongst the African delegations to really strengthen their national platforms so we can really spread the word from this assessment within the countries to national as well as to local governments. And then it's already been mentioned early in the introduction by Anne Larry-Godry about the international science policy space is very challenging right now. We have many COPs that haven't reached decisions this year. They're very difficult discussions because the challenges are so big and they're so interconnected, and many of the governance processes we have now have been very sectoral and very isolated from one another. So the question now is, how can we really bring this knowledge, the knowledge of the interlinkages that the Nexus assessment has analyzed, bring that into this intergovernmental and international space? So I very much look forward to how this report can be brought into those spaces, can help inform the governance, and hopefully, get decision-making really based on that knowledge, and the knowledge that incorporates not just the sciences that we hear a lot about, of course, but also different knowledge systems from indigenous and local communities as well, that of course is particularly relevant at local scales. So this report is about solutions. We've just heard about that, and I'm sure a lot of the questions from the media might be about solutions. So I think probably without further ado, I think it's good to get to that and to hear the questions that you all have about what this assessment holds. So I'll hand back to Rob with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. It has been fantastic being, for the first African IPBES plenary session with our first ever chair from Africa at a time when most of our newest member states on the IPBES platform have come from the African continent as well. So David, thank you so much, and it's great to also be back as a Southern African myself. I'd now like to mention that this brings us to the point in the program where we're going to open the floor to questions from the media. Because we have so many colleagues joining us online, we will begin with a few rounds of questions from our online audience. As one final reminder, please submit your questions using the question and answer function on the Zoom webinar. Please do not use the chat function. So I'm going to ask my colleague Carla if she could please read out the first question from our online audience. Carla?
Certainly. The first question comes from Chiranjeevi Kulkarni, I'm sorry for any mispronunciations, from the Deccan Herald. 2 questions. Firstly, I want to understand if the study will be followed by country-specific reports providing contextual and, more importantly, local scenarios and future Nexus pathways along with information on trade-offs. Second question, is there a mechanism within IPBES to ensure the reports are acted upon by the member countries?
So to our colleague from the Deccan Herald, thank you so much for that question. I think Dr. Anne Laragadri from the IPBES Secretariat would probably be quite well placed to answer that question. Anne, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So IPBES itself provides reports which are at the global level, and then we rely on our partners around the world to take these key findings and then apply them to their local circumstances or their local conditions. And so, for example, UNDP over the years has been funding national assessments of biodiversity and ecosystem services, which use the IPBES methodology and many of the concepts in particular of the IPBES global assessment, and apply these to various countries, particularly developing countries. And so here that would be the same. Now, in terms of the making sure that the findings are used by countries. So here again, IPBES relies on its partners. I mentioned at the beginning that all of the reports that IPBES undertakes are triggered by requests from particular governments and requests from particular multilateral environmental agreements. And for example, each one of the IPBES assessments is formally considered by parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity and lead to a decision which considers the implications of the key findings of an IPBES assessment for the work of its parties and the implementation of the convention. And here it will be exactly the same. And the Nexus assessment will be formally considered by the Convention on Biological Diversity, thus leading then countries through their national reports to also report on the key findings of the Nexus assessment.
Thank you very much, Anne. Also perhaps worth mentioning that one of the great value propositions of IPBES as an intergovernmental platform is that the reports are a product of both the work of the experts but also the governments themselves. So the fact that they are adopted and accepted by our member states makes it even more likely that they will be the basis of informed decisions. With that, Carla, do we have another question?
We do. The next one is from Kumbra Sirika, on behalf of a global collective of young indigenous communicators from the Global South. So many IPBES reports have called for recognition and enforcement of land rights and of dependence on traditional knowledge for the conservation of landscapes and water. This is implied, but not stated, in your list of response measures. Why is this? And would you want to be more concrete now in saying what the IPBES work has shown regarding the needs for rights?
So a question from Coimbra about traditional rights holders and the response options in the Nexus assessment. Could I ask one of our two co-chairs, Pam, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you for this very important question. So one of the things that we emphasize throughout the Nexus assessment is the important role that Indigenous peoples and local communities play. This includes having a very holistic worldview in how they manage across Nexus elements, particularly for biodiversity, water, and land. And the word nexus is a bit of a strange word for a lot of Indigenous communities, where the concept is just their way of life, their worldview. And so several of our response options really speak to that issue for Indigenous peoples. And I will say that one of our specific response options coming from the biodiversity chapter are rights-based approaches. And so we had a broad label for what are a number of very specific practices, which include recognition of land rights. So we point out in the report that this is not only a social benefit, not only a legal and rights-based benefit, but it gets you benefits across the Nexus elements. So it is an integrative approach. It not only supports the rights and interests of the rights holders themselves, the Indigenous peoples and local communities, but it provides broader and wider benefits for biodiversity, water, food, climate, and health, and therefore is worthy of support at different scales.
Thanks very much, Pam. We have a good number of questions flowing in now, but I would like to again urge everybody who is joining us online to please go ahead and submit your questions. Aditi, would you like to read the next question for us, please?
Sure. The next one is from Michael Lohmeyer from Die Press. Currently, the focus of governments is on climate primarily. Biodiversity is often seen as nice to have when affordable. How do we recalibrate the focus on the holistic problem?
So Michael from D-Press asking a question about the relative priority and attention given for climate change versus biodiversity. Would one of our co-chairs, Paula, over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for this question. I think what we try to do, certainly in looking at the current situation in Section A of the Summary for Policymakers, is actually show the importance of biodiversity for climate change mitigation and adaptation. If you look in our range of response options where we've scored them across the 5 Nexus elements, you can see that many of them have joint benefits across both biodiversity and climate. So what we're trying to say here is that we shouldn't be looking at climate action in a silo from biodiversity action. Many of the underlying indirect drivers that are responsible for climate change are also responsible for the degradation of nature. So joining the approaches together can help serve both issues, and they are both joint crises that we should be considering at this moment, as they are both urgent and need to be considered together.
Thanks very much. I'm also at some point going to ask our coordinating lead authors who are present as well if they'd like to add anything on to any of these questions, and I'm sure our co-chairs will also be asking them to add as well. But I'd now like to ask Aditi for the next question, please.
From Busani Bafana from the Interpress Service. You recommend the transformation of economic and financial systems to facilitate greater investment across the Nexus. Please elaborate on this transformation and how will it unlock funding for action?
I assume that's a Pam question. Pam, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Right now, our current economic and financial system is really not fit for purpose. It doesn't allow us to value nature in the way that we know we need to really account for Nexus interactions. Currently, we have negative financial flows going towards the degradation of nature that are in the order of $7 trillion per year. These are direct financial flows that damage nature. On the positive side of the ledger, we are spending about $200 billion in terms of direct biodiversity funding flows. If you do the math pretty quickly, you find out that that is a pretty big gap on the order of 35 times difference, prioritizing the negative over the positive flows. So it's clear that something needs to change. And one of the things that we do in the Nexus Assessment Report is not just say that there's a problem, but provide some solutions and some options. So for particularly in the financial and economic sectors, we talk about three main things that we can do to help us move towards an economic and financial system that supports the Nexus elements. So the first thing we can do is use information to help us understand all of the impacts that are a result of our economic activities. So this can include things like using metrics beyond GDP, the incorporation of expanded information in terms of appraising public spending, making sure that that's transparent, reporting requirements in the public sector. There's a lot of informational tools. A second category of things that we can do are to increase the access and accessibility of financial resources through all sorts of different and innovative financial instruments. So this can include everything from green and blue bonds to microfinance that targets the Nexus elements. Payments for ecosystem services are mentioned in our summary for policymakers. We have tax policies that we could use to increase the amounts of funding that are available. And finally, we need to have some options to help us reduce the negative incentives. All of the investment that's going into degrading biodiversity and other Nexus elements, we need to de-incentivize that, disincentivize that. So how do we do that? We can use safeguards and standards, and we can particularly tackle some of the difficult negative incentives, such as harmful subsidies that are still used in many of our resource-dependent sectors. So our argument is if we use these three categories of financial tools together, it's going to help us tackle the large-scale problem. There's no doubt that it's a big one, but we think with these tools and the information in our report, we'll really be able to help those decision makers move towards a more sustainable approach.
Thank you, Pam. And if I could also just ask any of our CLAs who would like to make a contribution, if you just indicate to me as well, I'll also then call on you to do that. So, Carla, do we have another question from our online audience? Actually, you know what? If you don't mind, I'm going to see if there are any questions here in the audience. I'm sorry I have actually been neglecting everybody here in the room. Would anybody in the room like to ask a question before I turn back to our online audience? Do I see any questions? No. Okay, then we go back to the online audience. Carla.
The next question is from Kenji Takana, who is a freelance reporter. This idea of all our crises being connected is not really new. We've had reports before about how things that are good for food are bad for nature. Is there anything really different about this IPBES report?
So, a question about the novelty value of the IPBES Nexus assessment. Paula?
Yes, no, again, thank you for that question. And there have been previous reports that have looked at maybe 2, sometimes even 3 interactions between different elements. So IPBES itself did workshop reports on the interlinkages between biodiversity and climate and between biodiversity and health. But this is probably the most ambitious report, looking at 5-way interactions between biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate change. And in addition to doing that, I think even though people might be aware that these interconnections exist and that they're important, actually knowledge on what those actual interactions are in different contexts and how specifically you go about addressing them through response options is very much missing from the evidence base. So that's what we spent a lot of our time doing. Probably 2/3 of the report is all on the what and the how can we address these interactions. So the over 70 response options make it very clear that there are options out there and they are available now for addressing these interactions. Whereas we see most of our systems that are governance systems and financial systems may recognize that they exist but completely ignore them. So again, the report provides the evidence that is actually more efficient to take account of these interactions. It can avoid duplicative policies. It can be lower cost. So I think there is very important evidence both on what can be undertaken, but also the how. We present this roadmap for Nexus Action, which takes you through these 8 steps in a process which is underpinned by a number of questions that all actors can use to help them move towards this more integrative and holistic governance. And I think, again, as it was mentioned earlier by both Anne and Rob, I think what's important and different about this, that this was a request from the 147 government members of IPBES to have this report. And these reports are scoped in terms of the chapters and the content that the governments would like. And then they are co-produced by this process of negotiation that we've been going through for the last week. And that makes them truly co-produced and intergovernmental products. And hence, I think this report stands the best chance of actually informing policy and action. Thank you.
Thanks for that great answer. Could we have the next question from our online audience, please?
The next question is from Felix Gouty from Actu Environment in France, sorry. How do the content and findings within the Nexus assessment, how are they linked with the transformative assessment presented tomorrow, and how are they different?
Thank you, Felix, for that important question. And before I hand that over to our co-chairs for a discussion, I would like to use this opportunity, it's a very good prompt, to just say that we are launching another report tomorrow for the media and for the public, which is the Transformative Change Assessment Report. And for those journalists who have received access under embargo to both sets of these materials, a reminder, please, that although the embargo has been lifted on the Nexus Assessment Report materials, the embargo remains on the Transformative Change Assessment Report until we launch that tomorrow. But to answer the question about what are the overlaps between these two reports, Pam, would you like to take that one?
Yes, happy to speak to that. I wouldn't say there's so much overlaps, but complementarities. So the thing that we really focused on in the Nexus assessment were very solution-oriented response options, as we've been speaking of. But we were very cognizant of the transformative change assessment going on at the same time. And so one of the things that we scored our response options on is their ability to contribute to transformative change. So there's a variable impact from some of these response options. Some are not quite as transformative as others, but some can be quite transformative, and they're able to help us tackle some of the practices and structures and values that are so important and so stressed in the Transformative Change Report. So as Rob said, the Transformative Change Report is still a bit embargoed, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but I will say in terms of process, we had lovely interactions with the co-chairs of the Transformative Change Assessment. We met regularly. We discussed our two assessments. We made sure that we were exchanging knowledge and ideas and approaches and terminology as much as we could. So we really think these are complementary products, and I hope when we see them out in the world, we'll often see them referred to together, because I think they really speak to the need for different strategies for a more sustainable world.
Can I
Please,
just
David,
add to that,
you have the
please?
floor as well. Thank you.
Thanks. I'd just like to that because as chair of the platform, of course, I've had an overview of both assessments quite a bit in the last months. And I think they start with the same initial premise. They start to look at the interlinked challenges that we have facing the world today. And the Nexus assessment takes as a starting point looking at the siloed actions. How do we get to integrate actions on the ground and address what actors are doing in their tangible, in their ways of life every day? Transformative change assessment looks at the underlying causes, tries to look at what are the values and why are people behaving in different ways. And I think they do come together from those two different perspectives and so provide very good sort of concerted answers together. Thanks.
Thank you very much. David, would any of our CLAs like to add anything? No. Then I ask Aditi for our next question, please.
The next question is from Daniela Sciaretti from Valor Economico. Do you think the 3 UN conventions should be somehow more connected to?
So a short and sweet question about whether or not we think there should be a greater level of connection between the 3 UN conventions. I think, Anne, this might be one for you.
Sure. So, well, back in 1992, when the 3 Rio conventions were launched, there really was not that level of understanding that we have now about the interlinkages between these 3 topics. And so, of course, it would be good to now have the opportunity to start from scratch and to really design things differently. However, that really would be a distraction, and it might take 10 years before we are able to really restructure the entire space. And so this is where reports like the Nexus assessment come in, because I believe that the response to the question should be that the 3 conventions should be being more mindful of the interlinkages with the other topics. And so, for example, the Biodiversity Convention is very mindful of climate change, and so I believe that this is a convention which has quite a broad vision. However, the same cannot be said for the Climate Change Convention, which really is very little aware of the interlinkages between climate change and biodiversity, and I'm hoping that the Nexus assessment is going to really make a difference in pointing out these really important interlinkages between climate change, biodiversity, food security, and that it will go a long way into building connections between the conventions.
Could I also add to that, Rob, from the perspective of the assessment? So yeah, as Pam was presenting in section C, there we have a box SPM 2, and in that we assessed the more than 70 response options against the goals, all 17 Sustainable Development Goals and all 23 targets of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and against the long-term mitigation and adaptation goals of the Paris Agreement. And all of those response options advance achievement of some of those policy goals and targets, and 24 of those response options simultaneously advance achievement of more than 5 of the Sustainable Development Goals and more than 5 of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework goals. So I think this really supports what Anne was saying, that there is evidence in the Nexus assessment that shows there are response options out there that can simultaneously address all of these 3 frameworks together and achieve those integrated benefits, even though the 3 conventions are still separate mechanisms.
I believe one of our coordinating lead authors would like to add something to that. Please introduce yourself and go ahead with the answer. Thank you.
So, hi everybody. My name is Nadia Sitas. I'm a coordinating lead author on the assessment, and I worked on chapters 4 and 7. And I thought it might be helpful, so we've kind of spoken at this at a number of different scales, and maybe to give a really concrete example. So while, there are lots of challenges across the RIA conventions, some of the response options that we looked at really do cut across all of those objectives between the conventions. And what we highlight in the report is an example from Rwanda, because often some of these examples are coming from places in the global north and they don't seem applicable in other places. But one of the examples from Rwanda was around implementing the RIA conventions in a more integrated way. So they didn't have separate plans to meet the goals of each of the different conventions, and they really found that doing this could reduce the transaction costs of land restoration by more than half. And so what we looked in the assessment was to find these concrete examples of these more integrated ways to achieve these multiple different policy objectives, and at the same time to have these nexus-wide benefits.
Thanks very much, Nadia, and we seem to be opening the floodgates with our coordinating lead authors, because I see another coordinating lead author who would like to take the floor. Please introduce yourself to our audience and take the floor.
Hello, Fabrice de Klerk, coordinating lead author for the food chapter. And Danielle, this question I appreciate in terms of coordination across conventions, but I think one of the key points of the assessment is not just across conventions, but if we think at the national level, coordination across ministries. What would happen if there's greater coordination across the Ministry of Health, of Agriculture and Environment? We also see significant action in cities. The city of Paris has a food strategy which has climate goals, is funded by water intervention, engages with farmers in the watershed, aims to eliminate hunger, aims to improve dietary diversity and healthy diets throughout the city. These are a great example of coordination. And of course, I think at individual levels as well. You know, when we talk about food, recognizing that transitions towards healthy diets are not just a health intervention, but they're a biodiversity intervention. They free up land for nature, and they're also an intervention that has significant impact on climate. So I think from across all scales, from the conventions to our individual behaviors, there's a real opportunity to think across the nexus.
Great, thank you very much, Fabrice. Could I ask Carla for our next question, please?
Yes, we have a follow-up question from Chiranjeevi Kulkarni from Deccan Herald. The report says the delay in addressing biodiversity loss would double by 2030 and $500 billion a year. Would IPBES seek periodic review of the adoption of the solutions by member countries? This is important from the context of low and middle income countries where genuine problems such as lack of information and funds and man-made ones such as lack of political will are big challenges for conservation.
So just to briefly restate the question, pointing to the message in the report about the delay and the costs of delaying action, and a question about whether or not that would mean that IPBES would be looking at periodic reviews to find out whether or not action had been taken. Anne, would you like to cover just that first part, perhaps, about periodic reviews? And
Yeah, so periodic reviews of national reports would be really more in the portfolio of actions by the Convention on Biological Diversity, where governments have to report on a regular basis through this National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan. And so it may be that following consideration of the implications of the Nexus assessment, then countries will have to report on those issues to the Biodiversity Convention, but that would be to the Biodiversity Convention and not to IPBES.
thank you very much, Anne. Pam?
I'd be happy to address the cost question, because I think
Thank
it's
you.
very important to understand what the report says in terms of the costs of delayed action. So there are a number of different studies that have tried to estimate what is going to be the total cost of trying to meet our biodiversity or our climate goals. And one of the things that's interesting is that we had a real problem finding cost estimates across all the Nexus elements. So that's a clear gap in information. But we do know that there are some estimates for biodiversity and then for climate. So our report highlights both of those. So for biodiversity, to meet our biodiversity goals, the estimate is if we wait 10 years, postponing action, it will double the cost of what we eventually have to do to reach those biodiversity goals. And that is because in the meantime, in that 10-year delay, we will be losing biodiverse lands, we will be losing species, we will have to restore those lands, we will have to have even more aggressive conservation measures, and all of these are going to cost money. So it's better to tackle them now while we still have time, as opposed to pushing them off to later. The $500 billion per year specifically relates to those climate policies. So it is a different figure. I just want everyone to be clear. So in terms of reaching our climate policy goals, again, the estimate is every year that we delay, we are increasing the costs of having to use our policies to meet climate goals at a cost of approximately, at a minimum, $500 billion per year. And I want to be clear, this is not an estimate of climate damages. Those estimates are far higher. This is just an estimate of the costs of policies to meet our goals. That is trying to catch up with mitigation actions, trying to catch up with restoration actions, the longer we delay in doing them. If I were to add the costs of climate damages to that figure, it would be far, far higher.
Thanks very much. Pam, Aditi, I believe you have another question for us.
The next one's from Vibha Vashne from Down to Earth magazine. How are these 5 crises identified? Should other crises be added to the current set of 5 in the Nexus and need to be observed simultaneously over the coming years?
Paula, would you like to take that one for us? The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So the 5 crises were identified by the IPBES members. So that was given to us as a mandate through our scoping document that they really wanted to understand interlinkages and solutions for addressing those really significant crises of biodiversity loss, climate change, water and food insecurity, and health risks. I mean, we have just been through the COVID global pandemic, so they're really very much at the forefront of people's minds and of the government members of IPBES. What we've done throughout the assessment as well as part of that mandate is where we look at climate change adaptation mitigation. We do that in reference to the energy system where that is relevant. We also have covered various cross-cutting issues that some would consider crises. So those are things like poverty and pollution. They cut across all of the different crises that we're looking at, and also sort of effects on air, water, and land. They all are considered as cross-cutting issues. So even though we don't identify them specifically as our 5 Nexus elements, we still consider them in the report and the solutions that we present.
Thanks very much. Carla, do we have another question from our online audience?
Yes, the next question is from Liam O'Sullivan from Horizon Times. You have presented a lot of options, these response options. Which of the ones you looked at are the best 3 that have the most positive effects on all these different challenges?
Thank you very much to Liam for that question. I know this is one of the questions that Anne always refers to about like trying to choose your favorite child when it comes to choosing the best of the response options or the response options with the most positive benefits. So I'm going to pass this very hot potato to Pam.
Well, luckily, I only have one child, so I always say that she is my favorite. But when it comes to response options, it is more challenging. So the whole point of the report is that we have an impressive range of options. And what we wanted to do is not single any particular one out as, quote, the best, but to score across them on all sorts of different indicators so that people in different circumstances, in different contexts, at different scales, can choose the ones that are most appropriate for them. So one key message is there is no single best one. There is no single one-size-fits-all solution. That's actually good news. It means we have a suite of possibilities that different people can choose from. And it avoids falling into simplistic traps that we should do one thing over another. It really calls us to think carefully about the co-benefits that could be achieved by using different response options. But there are a number of really impressive ones. I hope people take the time to read our list of more than 70 response options and to see how integrative they really are. So an example might be something like a response option to increase soil organic carbon. It's often considered an agricultural practice, primarily aimed at achieving yields, but there's also evidence that it strongly supports biodiversity and water retention in soils, contributes to higher food productivity, which has health benefits, and of course, soil is a major contributor to carbon sequestration to help mitigate climate change. So one of the things that's really interesting, if you look at the scoring of our response options, is that some of the response options coming outside of those traditional biodiversity channels, those biodiversity sectors, often have tremendous benefits for biodiversity. And I think that's a really important lesson. And I hope that means we can get the water sector, the health sector, the food sector, the climate sector to come on board and recognize that the contributions they can make to sustaining our biodiversity over the long term.
I see we have a couple of additional colleagues who would like to make contributions. Ro, would you like to introduce yourself and perhaps take the floor?
Hello, I'm Ro McFarlane, one of the CLAs. What I'd like to add to that, which I think is really important in terms of both the overall Nexus assessment and the response options, is that this is really engaged with health. And what is one of the most important things we can do is really get into the preventative space. And we've done that in terms of response options, but just before I say that, all of these elements are absolutely undermining health. The impacts are not even. They're very, very pronounced in developing countries and amongst vulnerable groups. But how do we go about this? One of the things is to look at the response options that we have from the health sector. We can progress universal health coverage, really see that we get health services out to everyone, that invest in that primary health care, making sure everyone does have access to clean water, healthy environments, nutritious food, safety, equity. And we can do this in a number of different ways. We've got both intensive, energy intensive, resource intensive health sectors, And we've also got very community and Indigenous knowledge-led health services. So we can promote intercultural health services. We can promote the sustainable use of medicinal plants. This is hugely important because 88% of WHO member states are using the non-conventional or non-mainstream medical services as really important part of what underpins people's health. And then in the resource-intensive health service, which contributes anything beyond, or we've said an average of 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions, but for the very resource-intensive health services, it's much more than that, even double. And just transforming that sector so that it's not making a big impact, or it's reducing its impact on greenhouse gases, on environmental footprints, again means that we're making getting health part of the solution. And I think that's a really important part of this Nexus assessment, really getting health engaged and really part of the solutions.
Thank you very much, Ro. And I believe we have another one of our CLAs who'd like to take the floor. Please introduce yourself to our online audience and go ahead.
Thanks, Rob. I'm Virginia Alonso Roldan. I'm a CLA of the biodiversity chapter, and I wanted to highlight, as Pam said, many of the more efficient options, response options to address all the elements of the Nexus come from other sectors, not the biodiversity or the classical conservation sector. But I would like to add that mainstreaming biodiversity in all the other sectors, I mean, having people from different sectors, from different place of action, is very important to benefit not only food, water, health, mitigate and adapt to climate change, but also to conserve biodiversity. And the biodiversity conservation is very important not only for the classical conservation sector, but for all the actors involved in this terrible global crisis.
Thank you, Ro and Virginia, for adding those very important elements. Aditi, I believe we have at least a couple more questions from our online audience, but I would like to just point out our time is fast approaching where we will have to start wrapping up. So any other questions from within the hall or anybody here in the audience who would like to ask a question before I return to our online questions? Nope. Then Aditi, please go ahead.
There's a follow-up question from Coimbra Sirica on behalf of the Global Collective of Indigenous Communicators from the Global South. The UNFCCC's Katowice experts found in a report on response measures that there have been significant negative impacts on forests and displacement of communities brought on by response measures to climate change. How would you recommend preventing harmful impacts of market-driven responses to biodiversity loss?
That sounds like a Pam question. Pam, over to you.
Yes, thanks for the question. We know this is part of the reason why the Nexus assessment is so important, because it points out if you prioritize one sector over the others, you often get negative trade-offs. And in this case, prioritizing climate change by focusing on inappropriate, exclusive tree planting in places where there are no social or economic benefits is exactly the sort of approach we don't want to be taking. So if we are able to recognize the interactions and the intersections across Nexus elements, we'll hopefully try to avoid some of those negative consequences. But I also want to stress that our focus on Nexus governance is another key way to think about these problems. And so we talk about how Nexus governance really enables integrative approaches, really looking at the problem holistically. It stresses inclusive, socially inclusive approaches that ensure that we don't have those sorts of maladaptations or discriminatory policies in place. Nexus governance has a very explicit focus on equity and justice, making sure that everyone benefits from response options, because we know that response options themselves are actually more effective when people are included in equitable ways. We actually get more effective biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate outcomes when we are socially inclusive and participatory. Nexus governance also stresses that we need mechanisms for collaboration and coordination. Again, focused on bringing Indigenous peoples as co-partners, ensuring that actions that are taking place are done in ways in which they have free, prior, informed consent. There are safeguards in place. And finally, Nexus governance really stresses the need to be adaptive and reflexive and experimental. And again, learning from what works and trying to choose pathways that'll move us forward. So I think, if we can reorient our systems to take these Nexus governance approaches, we'll be able to avoid some of those maladaptations that have occurred in the past.
Thank you, Pam. And I believe we have another two of our CLAs who would like to make an addition. So, Diana, would you like to introduce yourself and please take the floor?
I am Diana Mangalaju, CLA in Chapter 4 on the Nexus governance. And actually, I wanted just to comment on what Pam just discussed. One thing we also did in this assessment is to look at the tools you can use. And we looked at over 200 tools which exist, which are out there, and which can be used. And tools for evaluation and monitoring, tools in terms of information, tools in terms of scaling of some of the response options and how well basically they can respond to very specific situations. So that's something which can be very concretely used also by policymakers. But not only. We looked at policy tools, we looked also at community level tools and others. So that's, I would encourage also the audience to look also into these things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. I think the point and the takeaway from many of these responses is there's so much in this report to dive into and to find and to get more detail on. And Ralph, would you like to share some of those as well? Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Ralf Seppelt here from the responsible for Chapter 2 or Section A of the Summary for Policymaker. Yeah, Rob, you just was building the bridge exactly, because I wanted to point out that this example which was brought up by this question is one example, but we systematically also analyzed how indigenous people and local communities are affected, and especially in the first part of the Summary for Policymaker, we can show that these communities are affected proportionally much more from climate change effects, from food insecurity, from health effects. And so we could go beyond single case studies and show this in a consistent manner on a global scale.
Thank you both. I'm going to bring us to our final question of the day. Carla, would you like to share with us the last of the online questions, please?
Yes, the final question comes from Thabo Ndlovu. He is a freelance writer, and he asks, we are almost at the end of 2024. There are only 5 years left on the SDGs and the new biodiversity targets, but your report makes it sound like there are options we can choose that means we can still reach these goals. How realistic is that? And isn't this going to be incredibly expensive?
Paula, would you like to kick us off on that? I'm sure there'll be a few others who would like to chime in there as well.
Yes, of course. Yes, so thank you for the question. And yeah, we made the point earlier that yes, the 2030 deadline for the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal, is coming up rapidly. I think what the Nexus assessment report really underlines is the urgency of action now. Pam's already introduced that the delayed costs of if we don't act now and we wait till later, and also explain that the damages will continue to increase and these crises will continue to interact with each other, they'll continue to cascade, they'll continue to compound, and they'll continue to amplify each other. So the time to act is now, and that urgency is underlined in the assessment. What the assessment also does with providing these more than 70 response options and, in addition, this roadmap for Nexus action, it sort of provides a way forward that countries can use, either at national scale, subnational scales, or regional scales, or even in transboundary development planning processes, that they can use these steps in the roadmap to actually look at what they can use in terms of those response options for co-developing their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, their nationally determined contributions and their national adaptation plans, and the actions that they need to take urgently to address the Sustainable Development Goals, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Targets, and the long-term adaptation and mitigation goals of the Paris Agreement, so that when they are reviewed at 2030, we can see that action has really pushed things forward in this holistic and integrated way that we are suggesting is urgently needed as supported by the evidence in the assessment.
Thanks very much, Pam. And I think it would be perhaps a good question to also pose to the chair of IPBES about what can be done in the remaining 5 years. And David, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Rob. So anchored right in the assessment, I think one of the main messages from the response options, of course, is that everybody has a role. And because these response options go all the way down to act as sustainable, healthy diets, it depends on what you choose as a family to eat in the household, and also depends on the farms and the food system in a country, what is available. So everybody has a role in that, and they're all very interconnected. And the second main point, I think, is that this urgency of action that Paula mentioned is very important. 5 years is a very short time, and even if 5 years is not enough time to reach the goals, you can at least be heading in the right direction at an increasing rate. And I think that's critically important, because many of the indicators or aspects under the goals are going in the wrong directions, and these response options can help us turn them in the right directions. And then we can reach the goals at some point, even if it is a bit delayed. It's still worth doing that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. So before I thank all of our speakers, I would also just like to thank everybody who has participated online and here today. Obviously, this was about us sharing the messages, the options for action, and the data from this very important report. I'd also like to use this opportunity to talk about some other resources that are available. IPBES has a podcast called Nature Insight, and if you'd like to hear one of the very latest episodes, you'll hear both Pam and Paula talking in great detail about some very specific Nexus options, not least of which a fascinating bat option from North America, and something to do with the Pharaoh's Curse, and I will leave it at that. So if you're interested in following the IPBES podcast, please search for IPBES podcast online, or you can just go to ipbes.net/podcast. So that does bring us to the end of the Q&A, so the end of the question and answer session, and almost to the end of our media event. I'd like to remind everybody, particularly our journalist friends who are joining us, that tomorrow we will be launching the second of two very important IPBES assessment reports, tomorrow's report on transformative change. So, a big thank you to all of our speakers for their participation. A very big thank you to all of our experts here and elsewhere around the world for their incredible work that has led to the ability to launch this landmark assessment report on the Nexus. If you would like to arrange any media interviews with any of our experts, please send a message to ipbes, that's ipbes.media@gmail.com, ipbes.media@gmail.com. And then I would like to thank everybody who joined us today in person and on the webcast. This launch is the culmination of more than 3 years of work, but it is not the end of a process. If anything, it is the beginning of a process for the impact of the Nexus assessment on policy, on decisions, on action, and we hope on people's choices. So, thank you all again. The media launch and the webcast are ending at this point, but everything else begins now. Thank you so much.